The lawyer slides one page across the table, and it takes you 4 seconds to realize your father's entire estate fits on it. Not the house, not an account number. One line: to Polly, my 2009 Ford pickup, currently parked in my driveway. You wait for the second page. There isn't one. You're 34 years old, sitting in a strip mall law office in Ohio, wearing the black dress you bought for the funeral 3 days ago, and you're doing math you didn't expect to be doing. Your father worked as a machinist for 31 years. Overtime most weekends. He drove that same truck to the same plant for over a decade. You always assumed there was more somewhere. A retirement account, savings, something. The attorney closes the folder like there's nothing left to say. Your brother sits next to you in the office, and you can feel him doing the same math, the same silence, stretching a beat too long before either of you says anything. He asks the attorney, flatly, if there's a second account somewhere that just hasn't been located yet. Pensions sometimes take longer to show up, he says, like he's trying to talk the room into a better answer. The attorney tells him this is everything that was filed with the estate. One truck. No house, since your father had rented for years. No listed investment accounts. Your brother doesn't ask again, but you can tell he doesn't believe it any more than you do. You don't cry in the office. You cry in the parking lot, next to the truck itself, keys already in your hand because apparently that's yours now. The paint is chipped along the wheel wells. There's a crack in the windshield he never fixed. The odometer reads 191,000 miles. You sit in the driver's seat because you don't know where else to go, and the smell inside. Engine oil, sawdust, the pine air freshener he replaced every few months, hits you harder than the funeral did. For the first week, the truck sits in your own driveway untouched. Angry that a man who worked 6 days a week for 3 decades left you a vehicle worth maybe $4,000 instead of an inheritance that could have meant something. You start wondering if he spent it all. Medical bills, maybe. Bad decisions you never knew about. You loved your father, but grief has a way of making you ask ugly questions about someone who can't answer them anymore. Your brother calls that week too, mostly to check on you, but the conversation drifts toward the truck within a few minutes. He's carrying about $18,000 in credit card debt he's never told your father about, and he half jokes that at least you got something you can drive. You don't have the energy to explain that you don't even know if the truck runs reliably yet. You just say you'll figure it out, the same phrase you've used about 6 different things this week. The second week, you finally open the glove box, mostly to clean it out before you sell the thing. Registration. An expired inspection sticker. A stack of oil change receipts rubber banded together, dated back 9 years. Every single one, in his handwriting, with the mileage written in the corner. Underneath that, a small spiral notebook you don't recognize. You almost toss it in the donation pile without opening it. Something makes you flip to the first page instead. It's not a diary. It's numbers. Dates on the left, dollar amounts on the right, going back to when you were in high school. $50, 75, 110 some months. No labels, no explanation, just your father's cramped handwriting tracking something for almost 20 years. Your first thought is that he was tracking expenses for the truck. Your second thought, the one that keeps you up that night, is that the numbers only ever go up. You call your mother, who's been divorced from him since you were 19, and she goes quiet on the phone for a long moment. "He never told you about the account," she says. "Not a question. You didn't know there was an account." She says she doesn't know the details either. He stopped talking money with her a long time ago. But she remembers him mentioning a coworker who got him into something. A retirement thing. She doesn't remember the name of the bank. She tells you to check his mail. Your mother tells you something else, almost as an afterthought, that sticks with you longer than the rest of the call. During the marriage, money had been a constant fight. Not because there wasn't enough, but because your father wanted to save aggressively, and she wanted to enjoy what they had while they were young. She admits now, 20 years later, that she's not sure either of them was fully wrong. She just never expected he'd keep going after the divorce, alone, with nobody left to argue him out of it. The coworker's name, it turns out, was Frank, a name you actually recognize from a few company picnics when you were a teenager. Frank had worked the line 2 stations down from your father for over a decade and used to talk about his own retirement account like other guys talked about sports teams. Your father mentioned him occasionally, usually with mild irritation, calling him the guy who won't shut up about index funds. You always assumed your father was making fun of him. Standing in his kitchen with the statement in your hand, you understand now that irritation was just his way of admitting somebody had gotten through to him. You drive to his apartment the next morning, the one he'd rented since the divorce, small enough that the whole place takes 20 minutes to search. 6 weeks of unopened mail sits on the kitchen counter, most of it junk. Near the bottom of the pile, a statement from a brokerage firm you've never heard of. You open it standing in his kitchen, and the number at the top makes you sit down on a stool that wobbles. $261,000. Not a fortune, not a fantasy number, but real. Sitting in an account with your name already listed as the sole beneficiary. Your hands are shaking hard enough that you have to set the paper on the counter to keep reading it. There's a second page, a printout of his contribution history, going back 19 years, starting the same year the numbers begin in that spiral notebook. You do the math right there in his kitchen because you need to understand it before you can feel anything about it. 19 years. Average contribution somewhere around $90 a week, based on the notebook, though some months were leaner and some heavier depending on overtime. $90 a week is roughly $470 a month. Over 19 years, contributed alone, that's around $107,000 out of his own pocket. The account statement shows $261,000. The rest, $150-some thousand, came from growth. Not guaranteed, not promised, just what happened to compound quietly over nearly 2 decades in a mix of index funds his coworker had apparently talked him into back when you were 16. You also noticed something on the account paperwork you almost skipped past. A line showing employer matching contributions from the plant's retirement plan on top of what he put in himself. For years, the company matched 50 cents on every dollar he contributed up to a certain limit, meaning a portion of that $261,000 wasn't even his own money originally. It was money the plant offered to every employee on the floor, sitting there for the taking, that most of his coworkers never bothered to claim in full. Frank had told him that too, apparently. Free money, Frank used to call it, and for years your father apparently treated free money the same way he treated everything else. Quietly, without telling anyone, including you. You think about every year you knew this man. The same truck. The same 2 pairs of work boots he resoled instead of replacing. Christmas presents that were thoughtful but never expensive. You used to feel a small flicker of embarrassment about it in high school, when friends' parents showed up in nicer cars. You're ashamed of that memory now, standing in his kitchen with a piece of paper that explains exactly where that money actually went. There's a folded note inside the same envelope, and this is the part that breaks you completely. It's dated 4 years ago, his handwriting shakier than the notebook entries from earlier years. It says he thought about leaving you the account directly, letting you access it the day he was gone, but he'd watched too many people at the plant get a payout and burn through it in 18 months on things that didn't last. He wanted you to have the truck first. Something to drive, something to use, something that would make you sit still long enough to actually go looking for what mattered. He wrote that if you found this letter, it meant you'd already gone looking. That was the test, not whether you deserved the money, whether you'd take the time to understand it. You sit in his apartment for 2 hours after that, not doing anything, just holding the letter. When you finally do go home, you don't sell the truck. You can't explain that decision to anyone yet, not even to yourself, but something about driving it now feels different than it did a week ago. Here's where the story usually gets simple in your head, and it isn't. $261,000 sounds like an ending, like the part where everything gets resolved. It isn't the end of anything. It's the start of a decision you weren't prepared to make. The brokerage firm sends you paperwork. You have to choose whether to keep the money invested the way he had it, roll it into your own retirement account, or take a distribution and deal with what that would cost you in taxes. Nobody in your life has ever had to make this decision, so nobody can tell you what to do. You meet with a financial advisor recommended by the brokerage, mostly because you don't trust yourself to make the call alone. She walks you through it plainly. If you cash it out now, you'd owe taxes on the growth portion at your income bracket, and depending on how the account was structured, that could mean losing a significant chunk of it immediately. Not a small dent, potentially tens of thousands of dollars gone in a single tax year. If you roll it into an inherited account and let it continue growing, you avoid that immediate hit and keep the money working the way your father intended, though you'd still eventually need to take required distributions depending on the account rules at the time. She's careful to tell you nothing is guaranteed going forward, that markets move both directions, that the growth he experienced over 19 years isn't a promise for the next 19. You appreciate that she doesn't oversell it. She also explains something you hadn't considered. Depending on how the inherited account is classified, you may be required to withdraw a certain amount each year going forward rather than letting the whole balance sit untouched indefinitely, and those withdrawals would count as taxable income in the year you take them. It's not a punishment, she explains, just a rule tied to how these accounts work now. And it means part of your job going forward isn't just growing the money, it's planning around when and how you eventually touch it. You leave that meeting with a folder of paperwork thicker than anything you've ever read voluntarily, and for the first time in weeks, you actually want to read it. That night, you sit at the kitchen table with your husband and go through the folder page by page, translating the parts you understand into plain language for the parts you don't. He asks the kind of blunt questions you're too close to the situation to ask yourself, like whether keeping the truck running is really worth the money, or whether you're spending on it partly to avoid dealing with the actual decisions about the account. You don't have a perfect answer. You tell him both things can be true at once. You choose to roll almost all of it into your own account, structured to keep growing, and pull out $11,000, a number you land on after weeks of back and forth with your husband, for something specific. Not a vacation, not a car. You want to fix the truck. That decision makes no sense to anyone you tell about it. Your brother asks why you'd put money into a 15-year-old pickup with cracked paint instead of trading it for something newer. You don't have a clean answer for him. What you know, but can't fully say out loud yet, is that the truck stopped being a consolation prize the day you found that notebook. It became the physical proof of 19 years of a man choosing discipline over comfort week after week, without ever telling anyone. You take it to a shop 3 towns over that specializes in older trucks, run by a guy named Ray, who's been doing this since before you were born. New paint job, but not showroom. You specifically ask him to keep the dents from the job sites, the small dings that came from your father's actual life. New windshield. Rebuilt transmission, since the mechanic finds it's close to failing anyway. Ray tells you the frame's solid. The engine's got another 100,000 miles in it easy if you keep up the maintenance the way whoever owned this thing before clearly did. You don't correct him about the tents. While you're standing at the counter waiting on the estimate, Ray mentions offhand that he sees this exact situation more often than people would guess. Kids showing up with an old truck or an old car left behind by a parent, torn between selling it fast and keeping it out of guilt. He tells you the ones who end up glad they kept it are never the ones who kept it out of guilt. They're the ones who found an actual reason. He doesn't ask what your reason is. You don't offer it. But you think about the notebook the whole drive home. While the truck's in the shop, you start doing something you didn't plan on. You open your own brokerage account, separate from the inherited one, and you set up an automatic transfer. Not $90 a week like your father. You can't match that yet on your salary, but $40 every single week, no matter what. It feels almost embarrassingly small next to the number sitting in the inherited account. Your husband asks why you're bothering to save $40 when you technically don't need to right now. You tell him it's not about needing it. It's about understanding what your father actually did by doing a smaller version of it yourself. The first time you drive it home from Ray's shop, you take the long way, out past the old plant where your father worked, just to see it from the road. The lot's half empty on a Sunday. You don't stop. You just drive past slow enough to look, the new paint catching the afternoon light differently than the old chipped version ever did, and for a few seconds it doesn't feel like driving a truck at all. It feels like closing a loop you didn't know was still open. 3 months later, the truck's back in your driveway, and it looks like itself again, just steadier. You start using it for real things instead of letting it sit. Hauling mulch for the yard, helping your neighbor move a couch, driving it to work some days instead of your own car just because you want to. People notice. Your coworkers ask about the truck sometimes, and for the first time, you actually tell them the story instead of brushing past it. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th time telling it, you notice you're not crying anymore when you get to the part about the notebook. You're just telling it like it's true, because it is. The $40 transfer becomes $50 after a small raise at work. Then $60, after you and your husband sit down and actually look at your full budget for the first time in years. Something you'd never done together before this. Because before this, money was just something that existed in the background, not something you examined on purpose. You find 3 subscriptions you forgot you were paying for. You renegotiate your car insurance and save around $30 a month just by making one phone call you'd been putting off for 2 years. None of it is dramatic. All of it adds up the same slow way his did. You also finally ask your own employer about their retirement match, something you'd signed up for years ago at the minimum required amount and never revisited since. It turns out you'd been leaving almost $60 a month of free matching money on the table the entire time. The exact kind of thing Frank apparently used to lecture your father about at the plant. You bump your contribution up that same week. It's a small adjustment on paper, a few dollars less in your paycheck, but it's the first time you've made a financial decision because you actually understood the mechanism behind it instead of just picking a number that sounded reasonable. Your brother, watching all this unfold from a distance, finally asks you to help him look at his own numbers over dinner one night. You're not a financial advisor and you tell him that up front, but you sit with him anyway and go through his statements the way you had to teach yourself to. $18,000 in credit card debt isn't fixed in one dinner, but by the end of it, he's got a real plan instead of a vague plan. And he tells you afterward that it's the first time anyone in the family has actually talked about money instead of around it. Around the 6-month mark, an older man approaches you at the plant's annual retiree gathering, which you attend mostly out of obligation because your father's old supervisor invited you personally. The man introduces himself as Frank. You recognize the name before he finishes saying it. He tells you he'd heard through the plant grapevine that you'd kept the truck and started your own account, and something in his face shifts when he says it, like he'd been waiting to hear that for months without expecting to. He tells you your father used to show him the notebook sometimes, not to brag, just to prove to himself the numbers were real. Frank says your father once told him the whole point was never the amount. It was proving to himself, week after week, that he could keep a promise to nobody but himself. You don't fully understand what that means until you're driving home, alone, replaying it. A year after the funeral, you drive the truck out to the cemetery by yourself, which you haven't done since the burial. You don't bring flowers. You bring the spiral notebook, sitting on the passenger seat next to you the whole drive, like he's riding along to see what you did with it. You don't say anything profound standing there. You just tell him the account's still growing, that you started your own, smaller version of the same thing, and that the truck runs better now than it probably has in a decade. It feels less like grief by that point and more like a report he'd actually want. You think, sometimes, about what would have happened if he'd just left you the money outright. No truck, no notebook, no letter. You probably would have paid off some debt, maybe put a chunk toward a down payment somewhere, and moved on with your life a little more comfortably than before. That version isn't a bad life, but it isn't the one you got. And 18 months out from that day in the strip mall law office, you understand exactly why he chose it this way. He wasn't trying to make you rich in one afternoon. He was trying to make sure that whatever came to you would still be there in 20 years, because you'd actually understand what it took to build it. The truck still has almost 200,000 miles on it now, still parked in your driveway most nights, cleaner than it's ever been, but with the same dents from his old job sites still visible if you know where to look. Some evenings you sit in the driver's seat for a few minutes before going inside, not doing anything, just sitting there the way you did in that parking lot the day everything started. Your own account is nowhere near $261,000 yet. It's a fraction of that. Built from $60 weeks instead of $90 ones, still young enough that most of the growth hasn't had time to show up yet the way his eventually did. Some weeks you look at the balance and it feels almost pointless next to the number that started this whole thing. Then you remember his account didn't look like much in year one either. It just looked like a man in a truck, driving to the same plant, putting money into something nobody around him could see. Your brother started his own small automatic transfer 2 months ago, $20 a week, embarrassed to even mention the number out loud at first. You told him the number doesn't matter as much as the week it starts, and the week after that, and the one after that. You're aware, saying it, that you sound exactly like a man you spent most of your adult life thinking never explained anything to you. It doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels like the only inheritance that could have actually taught you anything. The kind you can't spend, only carry forward, 1 week at a time, the same way he did.